Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Cognition, an Erica Reed thriller for PC, Mac, and iOS. This is a 4-part episodic point-and-click adventure game by Phoenix Online Studios that was released between October 2012 and September 2013 on PC and Mac, and it later saw release on iOS. And it's fairly interesting for a variety of reasons that I'll get to more when I get to the gameplay and the story portion. But something that's worth noting is that they have Jane Jensen on this as a story consultant. If you don't know who that is, then that's kind of depressing because she made my favorite adventure game of all time, which is Gabriel Knight's Sins of the Fathers. So needless to say, I was pretty intrigued going into this thing and very curious about how they pull it off, so let's just go ahead and find out. As far as the presentation goes, it's very much a mixed bag, but most of that does stem from the visuals, and you can very easily tell that just by looking at the footage I'm showing you. This is on the highest detail setting in the game, and you can very easily see that while the environments look fine and are actually very well detailed and the artwork's very nice, and generally the cutscenes are okay because they're this kind of bizarre slideshow digital painting kind of thing that is very reminiscent of something like Gray Matter if you've seen that or played that. Pretty much the same idea here for the cutscenes. What really kills the visuals is the character modeling and animation, which looks like it's out of a game many, many years older than this actually is. Now, they were going for a kind of graphic novel art style, and while they managed to pull that off for the most part, the animations just kill it. And that's mostly because you look at these characters and they interact with things really bizarrely. They don't move right. They move really stiffly and awkwardly. They interact with things with kind of floaty hand syndrome, I guess is what you would term it. And it just ends up looking pretty terrible. But that's pretty much the only major thing wrong with the visuals, unless you just don't like the art style. Because everything except the character modeling and animation is perfectly fine. And then we come to the sound design, which is also a bit of a mixed bag, but certainly much less so than the visuals. And most of my issues with the sound are really more just personal dislikes rather than actual issues. On the one hand, you have the music, which for the most part is pretty good. If you have the stuff that Austin Haynes composed directly for the game, it's actually pretty good stuff. And it's very atmospheric and works really well. And then you have the other things that they threw in there, like featuring the Scarlet Furies. Look, I didn't like the Scarlet Furies in Gray Matter, I don't like them at all, and I certainly don't like them being shoehorned in here because Jane Jensen and Robert Holmes were part of the project. And I don't know what was going on with the tracks that it's playing during the credits sequences, but those are really annoying. But the only other major issue I had was with the voice acting, and most of the voice acting is perfectly fine, actually. The characters are portrayed pretty well, and there's actually a fair bit of emotion thrown in there. It's just that some of the line delivery comes across as awkward or forced, and kind of amateurish in a lot of ways. But this is a fairly small project, so I'm more willing to let that kind of thing slide. What I wasn't so willing to let slide was just something that was kind of amusing to me, and that is that the voice actress who plays Erica Reed decided to try to put on a Boston accent. Now here's the thing about that accent, and this may be especially informative for those of you who are not Americans and don't actually know what a Bostonian accent sounds like. It's actually a pretty hard accent to pull off unless you're from around that area, and that's because they have a very bizarre way of saying things compared to pretty much every other accent in the entire United States. It takes a lot of effort to really pull off. I pride myself on being able to pull off a fair number of accents, and I cannot come anywhere near pulling off a Bostonian accent because it's just so bizarre compared to literally every other accent I can try to pull off. Now, I do commend the voice actress for trying, because she actually did a pretty good job with the character overall, but sometimes that accent just ends up sounding kind of ridiculous. But that's really the only black mark in the voice acting other than it just kind of sounding a bit amateurish. Which, again, I can let that slide. So the last bit of sound to talk about is, of course, the sound effects themselves, and they're pretty well done for the most part. You don't really have anything that sounds out of place, and everything works pretty well. So overall, the sound design is actually a pretty solid thing, apart from those handful of issues that I mentioned. And it's really only the visuals that brings the whole presentation down. But absolutely what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story is one of the strongest elements of the game, so I really don't want to spoil that for you. Suffice to say, you play as Erica Reed, who's a federal agent who is on the trail of the serial killer, the Kane Killer, whose MO is basically devising these horrible traps for siblings and then murdering them with them. And she has a special interest in this case because she actually loses her brother to the Kane Killer in the prologue of the game. And so what ends up happening is the case ends up going cold and closed, and she gets moved to other cases, and that's where the actual gameplay takes place. Now, in addition to being a crack agent, Erica has a very special ability known as post-cognition. She is capable of seeing the past of objects she touches. Now, this also affords her some really nasty visions that she starts getting at the beginning of the game, and I don't want to go too deep into those because that's where you get into really heavy spoiler territory. Suffice to say, those do actually serve a purpose in the narrative, although they do actually get kind of annoying because they get repeated very, very often, especially in the earlier 2 episodes. And while it does take a couple of episodes to really get the story going, by basically the early parts of the 2nd episode, it's incredibly engrossing. It's a very well-written detective story with the addition of the supernatural in there, because again, she does have this supernatural cognitive ability. And there's also a pretty strong overarching plot tying everything together and keeping everything from getting really fragmented and out of place. So the story's pretty cohesive despite having this episodic structure, and it works pretty well. Now, the one area that could have been improved is the characters. Now, if you're talking about, say, Erica or her partner John McCoy, or certain other characters that I don't really want to get too much into, they're actually fine. They have quite a bit of character to them, they have their own personalities, they have depth to them, they have various motives for doing what it is they're doing, and it all makes sense, and you can actually get behind them. And then there are some of the other characters who are basically just one note. And it's really hard to try to get behind these characters as well, even though they do have their own reasons for behaving the way they're behaving. It's just hard to get behind them when they only do that one particular note. For example, one of the characters that's introduced fairly early on is Director Davies, who is Erica's boss. And she comes across as just a total hard-ass, and that's pretty much her entire personality. Now, they do try to give her some depth and do a decent amount of success by giving her this backstory and these various elements to her character that make her more than just a hard ass, but she only behaves as a hard ass. And so it's really hard to get behind the character as a result, even though you know all these things about her. But apart from that particular issue, the writing is all pretty solid, and it works very, very well in this game's favor. So, what about the gameplay? Well, like I said, it is a point-and-click adventure game, so most of what you're doing is moving Erica around, interacting with various objects in the environment, talking to people, trying to solve puzzles, that sort of thing. They do throw in a few other bits to the gameplay, like sort of quick-time events, where they're not really quick-time events, they're just quickly timed puzzles, and so you just have to interact with the right object or the right thing at the right time, and it will do just fine. So, it's the kind of thing that you've seen in other point-and-click adventure games before, but in this particular case, the only one that really bothered me was the puzzle at the very, very end of Episode 4. Because up to then, the vast, vast majority of the puzzles were all these logic-based, investigative kind of puzzles where you're looking around in the environment for things that might seem out of place, or you're looking for evidence, or any number of things like that that you would pretty much expect an investigator to be doing, and you're applying those to actually trying to track down these serial killers and bring them to justice. And so it's very compelling, and it fits in with the game perfectly. And then just at the very end, they throw in these vaguely lazy, uninspired kind of puzzles that don't really require a huge amount of effort, but really more just trial and error. And it just was kind of disappointing. But up until then, the vast majority of the puzzles were never too difficult. They were always logical, and if you paid attention to what was going on around you, if you tried to pursue all lines of questioning and things like that, it all made sense. And it felt like playing kind of an old-school adventure game in a lot of ways, where you're basically just piecing together all of the evidence and trying to get various conclusions out of it. And it was all very compelling and interesting, especially since they utilized the cognitive abilities to such a great effect. Now, in Episode 1, you don't get the full extent of Erica's abilities, but by the end, she has a lot of different cognitive abilities that she can apply. So early on, you have the ability to just touch objects and see their past, so that will give you some sort of insight into what actually happened in a given location. And over time, you will gain abilities like projection, which basically you're using various things in the environment to project what actually might have happened, or just some specter or something in your mind anyway. And eventually you also get regression and synergy. Now, synergy is just combining objects in your inventory to get some sort of idea of their past. And regression is basically being able to go into someone's memories and actually piece them back together so you actually get a clear picture of what's going on. And unlike, say, Gray Matter, where the main character being a magician was kind of a secondary element, the cognitive powers that Erica has are an integral part of the game, and they are used all the time to great effect. And it's really cool to see this interplay between not just the normal, logical, investigative stuff, but also the supernatural ability that she has, and then them melded together so well. And of course, as you go through the episodes, the puzzles get more and more complex, but they never feel like they're out of your reach. They never feel like anything was designed to be just completely devious and unsolvable, or just have this bizarre, nonsensical logic like old-school Sierra games used to have. Instead, it feels like a pretty natural progression, and things build up and build up until you finally get to the conclusion of the game, which ties everything together pretty well and leaves you pretty satisfied. So what you have here is an excellent point-and-click adventure game that, despite the problems it has, also comes with some excellent writing and some really great design. So if you're a fan of point-and-click adventure games, you will definitely want to play this thing. It may not be perfect, but it is well worth picking up. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.